Thank you everyone for joining me. Tonight we're going to be talking about, as the sign says, the gods and goddesses of the Jutes, or Jutes, as we would say in modern English. The Jutes were a Germanic group who came over with the Engels and the Saxons, and took over what became England in the early medieval period. I'm not going to go too much into the history of these peoples. I've done that previously, and that would take a whole show in itself, a whole thing in itself. So let's start from the beginning. Who am I? I'm Paul. Nice to meet you all. You can find me on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, under the Sacred Isle. I always start off by this wonderful quote from my beautiful friend David Southall: "Nothing is made up, just remembered differently." And I think that's a really important thing to remember when we're telling stories and we're in a storytelling environment. And there's a reason for that, and that's simply because it's too easy to get wrapped up in what may or may not have happened. And when we're talking about these stories, think of it this way: there's a reason that we call it spellbinding. So each of the stories, you are taking the time out to build those magics within the words, and that's what it's all about. And the magic for each of the stories and the characters all come from the retelling. So that's just something that we should always remember. Nothing is made up, just remembered differently. So section 1, introduction. What we'll be talking about? Well, we'll be talking about what I've basically called the gods and goddesses of the Jutes, but we'll talk. The concept of gods and goddesses is a little bit different to what you may be thinking, and the way that we think about these things in today's world. And so we'll get to that. I'll run quickly through some of the references that I've used over the past however many years. We'll go through the concepts that we'll need to talk about so that you understand the stories in their fullness. We'll go through the gods of the week, why we call each of the gods that lend their names to the days of the week, and we'll go through the lesser known Ithans. Now I'll tell you what that word Ithan means very, very soon. Right, so my references, we'll just go through this very quickly. The heroic poems, the wisdom poems, and the Christian poems from the Anglo-Saxons. Lots of stuff in the British Museum, English Heritage. I've leaned very heavily, well, to a lesser extent, but quite heavily on Jacob Grimm's work, and a little bit of Snorri Sturluson, who wrote down the Icelandic Eddas, or their Icelandic poems, and that's kind of where we get a lot of the Nordic sagas from, but not a great deal, because there was a divergence, but they're a good reference to have. So if you ever need to sort of delve into this yourself, these are the places that you want to be looking. And the very last part, which is the most important part, is whatever the wind sort of whispers in my ear. And I think that's always a good place to start. So what are the Ithans? The Ithans, or the Ithan, is the preternatural, the otherworldly entities. I mean, the root of the word entities comes from this. They are what we kind of call the gods and the goddesses and spirits and elves and all those sorts of creatures. And so when we want to talk about them collectively, we kind of talk about them as the Ithans. And there kind of wasn't this great distinction that you might think between all these different races or tribes or whatever you want to call them. They were invoked similarly. They had personalities, and invoking an Ylfe or an Ylfe or Ylfe or elf, as we would call them now, or a fairy, would be the same as invoking a god or a spirit. So it's very, very important to remember that actually there's not a huge difference between these creatures and what they are and who they are. So what's the difference between the gods, the Ylfe, and the spirits? Well, it's kind of a gray area, really. The gods tend to be very much about up on high creation and sort of battling amongst themselves in some cases. The Ylfe are more earthbound or earthen, I guess, or and if you're looking at in the Nordic tradition, they'd say Midgard in the Anglo-Saxon, the Jutes. It would be Middle Earth, what we call Middle Earth, or the Middle Realm. Tolkien got the concept of Middle Earth from the Anglo-Saxons, the Jutes. The idea is that the Middle Realm, and so it's cognate of Midgard. So the Ylfe are kind of more involved in Middle Earth, and the spirits are more ethereal, more soul-like, ghosts, that sort of thing. Far less tangible, but just as real, really, in the eyes and the minds of the Jutes and the Anglo-Saxons. You could invoke the spirits. You could invoke your ancestors to intercede on your behalf. You could evoke the Ylfe. The idea that elves or fairies are tricksters and that sort of thing is also prevalent, but so could be said for the gods. So one of the big mistakes people kind of make about the gods is that they're kind of worshipped on high, and they have this Abrahamic concept of building, praying to, and worshipping and devotion to, whereas the gods didn't really, they kind of didn't care. They weren't these jealous type gods. They would intercede on your behalf, and have prayer was more like sending something out into the ether and just hoping that they might pick it up, and every so often they would, and then depending on how well you please them, they might help you or they may not. They weren't constantly listening to humanity, or they're not constantly listening to humanity. Their intercession into Middle Earth was generally for their own entertainment, but that's not to say there wasn't a relationship, and we'll get onto that in a second, because there certainly was a direct relationship between the gods, the Ylfe, and the spirits, and basically the Itans and humanity, and that relationship was very much, you could almost see it as, if you think in terms of meeting someone famous. If you met a god, you would do your best to make them happy, and they might show favor upon you. You'd invite them in, you'd give them food and drink and all that sort of stuff. Oh, hang on, someone just said, sorry, I think you're screen sharing your Word document. Oh, am I? Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Is that better? Sorry about that. Yeah, well, you got to see my wonderful notes. So there was definitely this relationship between humanity and the Ettins, and that relationship could be a one-to-one relationship, but when they weren't about, it was very much this vague relationship, and you got their attention by sacrifice and ritualistic, and telling their stories. By telling their stories, you are invoking them. By telling the stories, what you're doing is you're making magic, because there's no distinction between magic and the gods and all that sort of stuff. They are very much one and the same thing. So what are the gods? So the gods are the Oser. There are two types. So there's the Oso Ise being the plural. They were kind of the gods that you probably know, Woden, Thunar. So Woden is cognate of Odin or Odin. Thunar or Thunor is cognate of Thor. Frige, Frigg, Tu, you may not have heard of Tu, Helan or Hel, and Lok, everyone knows Loki, Lok. Then there's also the Wen. The Wen were kind of the other type of gods, still gods, but the other type. These are more, I guess, loving gods rather than warlike. They're predictable, unlike the Ise gods. The Ise gods are much more well known because they're far more exciting, and they got up into adventures and all that sort of stuff. But the Wen, not so much, and there were a lot more of the Wen. So there was Ingui and Freo. They were twins, Ingui and Freo. Ingui is they were the gods and the goddesses of the Ylfe. Freo, or Freya, as you may know her, fertility and beauty and all that sort of stuff. And you had Neorth, who was god of the seas and fishermen, Eostre or Eostre, which you'll know she lent her name to Easter. And there's Gethar, who started off the wyrd, the mother of the three mothers, the Modre. And you had Niht, who is the mother of Eorthe, Eorthe being the earth, and Niht being the goddess of night. Sigal Osuna, goddess of the sun. Mone, the goddess of the moon. And my favorite and a very enigmatic god, the Undirgoð, the god beneath. So all these gods have their own personalities, and if we're talking about the better keep my eye on the time. If we're talking about the Ylfe, you have Woden. We'll go into these in more detail because in a second, because they are the gods that lent their names to the days of the week, except for Helan or Hel or El and Loch. So Loch is cognate of Loki, trickster god, and he's not what you think. He doesn't play tricks. He's just an out-and-out liar. I mean, that's basically what he is. And he wasn't hated by the other gods. He was best pals with Thunar. He was the blood brother of Woden. So Loch was kind of, I guess, Thunar's uncle in a way. And Thunar would go and find Loch, and they'd go out on adventures. But Loch just loved to tell lies and loved to sow chaos. But he was the direct. They worked well because he was the direct opposite of Thunar. Thunar was all about following the rules and doing what he had to do, and militaristic. Whereas Loch was fluid and hedonistic, and I kind of liken him to a god version of Byron. His sexuality was fluid. His in this day and age, we'd say that he was gender fluid. He sometimes was a woman, sometimes was a man. He gave birth, but he also was a man. So a wonderful, wonderful character. And then we have the Ylfe. So again, there are all sorts of Ylfe, and in fact, the old people of the Isle of Wight used to call the elves the Ylfe, which is just basically a direct phonetic translation of the Ylfe. So you have the Modre, which I spoke about earlier, the three mothers. The Freya, who is the lord of the Whist or the Wisht, and we'll talk about him in a minute. And also one of my favorites is this creature is, I guess, kind of like the old Valkyrie, that sort of cognate, but and the name is pronounced Valkyrga, and the Valkyrga chose who lived and who died. And you also have Kuma, who was kind of the Ylfe who was interested in the introverts. And you had Ilki and Bill, and they were young children, brother and sister. And we'll talk about them. They were kind of the prototype of Jack and Jill. And if we look at the name Ylfe, an old Isle of Wight name last name is Ylfe, Yelf. It's also, and if you actually map that last name out, you'll see that it actually, although the name has almost died out now, but the places that it has been almost maps directly to the Jutes kingdoms. So the Miowa and Cantavara and the Isle of Wight. So it's very much a Jutes name. In fact, we have a road in Ryde called Ylfe's Road and a hotel called Ylfe's Hotel. So how did worshipping work? So the worshipping worked by saying prayers, rituals, sacrifice. If you wanted to start a family, you'd sacrifice to Frige, or you might sacrifice to Freo. If you wanted, if you were going into battle, then you might sacrifice to Tew or to Thunar. If you wanted to for the harvest, and you wanted to ensure that things would go the way that you wanted, then Ingui. So that's kind of how it worked. But you also had priestly classes, almost witch doctor like, I guess, who would instruct, and they'd also give the law. So there was still that. So you did have sort of temples, but there were more holy places, holy wells, lots of holy wells, holy streams, groves, and that sort of thing, rather than actual temples as such. So that's a summary of the Etons and the different types. And that's only a summary of the gods and goddesses. There is so much more, but we don't have time. So we've got 20 minutes to spend on the gods of the week. So let's move on to the gods of the week. Where do the names come from, and why is Saturday the odd one out? So we'll get to Saturday last. Let's talk about, let's start from Sunday. Sigal Osuna. And here she is. Sigal Osuna. She's the goddess of the sun. Her skin is radiant, the color of gold. Sigel is the shield against the night. So her story is she traverses the sky with a flaming sword that she uses to cut through the veil of night and darkness, cut through the veil of winter. And in her other hand, she holds the torch that is the sun. And she uses that to illuminate the world. But all the while, she is chased by the wolf of winter. The wolf of winter and the wolf of darkness. The wolf continually trying to catch her and stop her from stripping through the darkness of winter. Where the wolf of winter goes, winter comes with him. And you see the distance between Sigel and the wolf of winter as you move up to midsummer. When she's in her full bloom, that is her sacred day, sacred time, where offering and sacrifice were given, where quite often there would be magical hunt, the magical hunt where people would run through the forest reenacting stories from Woden to Sigel and the chase of the wolf. She's also the sister of Mone, the sun god, the moon god. The other interesting thing you'll notice is that she is the sun goddess, whereas most other traditions have a sun god. In the Anglo-Saxon tradition, we had a sun goddess. She is seen as a life giver, as the embodiment of everything that is needed to grow and harmonize and make beauty. Now, it's said that sometimes the wolf will start to catch up to her. And when he does, we have an eclipse. An eclipse basically is when the wolf catches up to Sigel, and he will devour her. But as he does, she gives birth to herself, and renewal and it all starts again. But the lead up to that is a terrifying time, a time of darkness and bewitching. But in the end, a new cycle will start. And you'll see this theme of new cycles all the way through these belief systems. Even if we go back and we have a look at the stories of Norse mythology, and everyone will have heard of Ragnarok, the end of but it's not really the end of time. It's the end of this cycle where things will start again. And that's what will happen if there's an eclipse. And some say that once she hits her brightest in midsummer, and the days start to grow shorter, she starts to become sleepy, and her powers start to wane. And as she does, she eventually comes to rest in the bosom of Niht, who will protect her from the wolf. So the goddess of night, Niht, Niht, will protect Sigel from the wolf during those winter months when the wolf actually has much more free reign. So on to Monday, Moon Day. As I said, brother of Sigel. And he, we haven't changed the slide. We should do that. There we go. There he is. What a handsome fellow he is. He, keeping in mind that these drawings that I've done are my interpretations. And we don't have any great description, just vague descriptions of their personalities. So we don't know what they look like in a lot of cases. So I've just interpreted these characters. So Mone, Monday, Moon's Day, brother of the sun. He carries a great orb and is protector of the Ylfe children, Ylke and Bill. And who are they? Well, we don't really know a lot about them. In fact, the only reference we really have is Snorri. We don't even have an Anglo-Saxon reference to them, but we kind of think that they, probably a very similar idea. And the fact that we have Jack and Jill, who appears to be almost, there are similarities between the two children. So Ylke and Bill, they have a water pail. Ylke, the sister, is the older one, and they carry this pail. And in some believe that as the pail starts to lose water as they walk around the orb of the moon, that creates the phases of the moon, but we're not quite sure. And Mone is said to, the story of Mone is slightly different to the Norse, in that he rides upon a great hound called Rita, a giant hound that takes him through the sky. Although in the Norse tradition, Mani, as he's called, rides a chariot. Okay, on to Tuesday. And here we have, now we're getting into the gods that you, rather, the difference between the sun and the moon is the sun and the moon are kind of time. They're outside of our concept of the world. They're time gods and goddesses, and they don't kind of interact so much. Whereas now we're in Tuesday, and it literally is Tuesday. Tu is the god. He's a one-handed warrior god. He's a warrior and strong. Tu is the judgment and the law. Sacrifice to bring the might. In battle, there is no other. So Tu sacrificed his hand to the great wolf to trick him so that he could defeat him. So he sacrificed his hand, distracted the wolf, and then defeated him with his sword. There was no swordsman like Tu, and even when Tu lost his fighting arm, he was still able to beat others with his left hand or his right hand. I'm not sure whether he was left or right-handed. But he's also the god of justice, and here you'll see him depicted holding scales with people's hearts. So he was like a lot of the Issa gods. They were very much ruled by honor. Even Locke took his oaths seriously. And I know I'm on a bit of a tangent here, but when Locke, although he told lies, he would never break an oath. So if he gave an oath, he would always honor it. He may look for a way out by breaking the rules slightly. So, for instance, he had a bet with the Ylfe. He and Thunar were there, and he bet that Thunar could eat and drink more than their champion. And he said, "I am so confident that if I lose, you can take my head." Anyway, Thunar loses, and they come and get Locke's head, and Locke says, I didn't say anything about my neck. So he was able to get away with it, although he did get his comeuppance. They knocked him into the ground and sewed his mouth shut, so he couldn't tell any more lies. So he kind of did get his comeuppance. But they took the point is they took their oaths very seriously, and that's why Tu is the god of justice, because he takes he is the embodiment of swearing one's oath. He was extremely popular. In fact, he may well have been the greatest of the gods until usurped by Woden. He is also thought of as a sky god of the sky. Not in the same way Thunar is thought of, but very much an entity of the sky looking down. But he was very popular, and you'll see Tu, or the name Tu, through the British Isles, or through certainly southern England, in certain place names. So the cult was quite strong, but over time it was surpassed by Thunar. So he lost, as I said, he lost his hand to the wolf, and in Anglo-Saxon we call the wolf Fenric, who happens to be the brother of Helan. So this great giant wolf is the brother of Helan, the goddess of hell. Now, hell is not what you think of. It's not a place of torture. It's just the underworld. And they were both children of Locke. So there's that relationship. And as I said, extremely popular, particularly for the warrior class. So moving on to our next fellow. Wednesday, Woden's Day, as we'd say now, Woden, father of all, bringer of knowledge, seeker of wisdom, not only knowledge, but wisdom. Only those who are chosen will go to thee in glory. What does that mean? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about Woden, but also the concept of the wyrd. And you'll hear me speak about the wyrd quite a lot, and you hear that. And it's kind of wrongly translated to fate because it means so much more than just fate. We'll talk about that soon. So Woden is sometimes, because he's cognate of Odin, is sometimes called the All-Father, father of all, or father of the gods, and the father of Midgard or Middle Earth. He's the god of wisdom. It's also considered what's called psychopomp, which basically means he takes the souls of the dead. And he does that in very specific circumstances. We'll talk about that in a minute. He's very much associated with ravens, which are also, have this wisdom about them. The ravens talk, and he's very much associated with that. Husband of Frige, father of Thunar. He said, and in this picture you see the hanged man, you see him hanging himself. He sacrificed himself to himself to gain knowledge and wisdom. Or to gain knowledge. He then pulled out his eye. So he only has one eye, but he pulled out his eye and threw it into the waters of wisdom to be able to use that knowledge, because there's no point in having knowledge without that wisdom. And he's also considered the father of kings. The Anglo-Saxon kings all said they could trace their lineage back to Woden. They would call themselves the sons of Woden. And so the father of the kings, father of Thunar, as I said, blood brother of Lok, which Lok took very seriously. Also very, very popular was Woden. And you'll see that in names. In fact, on the Isle of Wight, Woden's place, Woden's town, Woden's place. So you'll see the name in places all around England or southern England, and also in the Danelaw as well. Extremely popular. But as I said earlier, he kind of usurped Tu's place as the head of the Eostre, but no one's quite sure when and why or how that happened, and it just could have been purely down to popularity. Now, I mentioned that he's a psychopomp. He takes the souls. So here's the thing, and we'll talk about this in greater detail in one of the stories when we get to the lesser gods. Woden found out about the end of this cycle, and he needed to build an army. So he decided that what he would do is he would grab the greatest warriors. And that's where this concept of dying in battle, of being honorable and desirable, because they believe that Woden plucked you out to come and fight with him at the end of this cycle. And this plays into the idea of the wyrd. And we'll talk a little bit about that in more detail when we start talking about the lesser known gods. On to Thursday, Thor's Day, as they would say in the Nordic tradition. Thunder and storms, how mighty is your name. Adventure is your nature, quick to anger, slow to quiet. Son of the ravens, son of Woden. So Thunar quickly has always been very popular. He is the warrior archetype. He is what people think of when they think of the Anglo-Saxon warriors. That's who the warriors wanted to be like: strong, undefeated, a champion. Where Tew was justice bound and the greatest of warriors, Thunar was far more exciting. He was hot-headed. He was the man to run in straight and not think and fight and beat the enemies. And he was ever so popular. And you'll see his name again, just like Woden, just like Tew. You'll see his name in the names of places. On the Isle of Wight, Thorley, Thorness. So his name is invoked in those place names. And like I was saying earlier, just talking about him, talking about the stories, is what gives these characters power. It's what invokes them. It's almost the prayer that you may think of now. Sitting down, they would sit down and talk about these, and they'd tell these stories, and they would embellish these stories, and they would create new stories. And this is one of the things I say is my talks are not for recreationists. And why, you might ask, and what's a recreationist? We'll talk about that in a minute. The reason I say they're not for recreationists is because recreationists are looking for a purity that doesn't exist. They're looking for a history that no longer is there because it never existed. The stories, the mythos, the things that were about these gods were stories that men told, and people knew that. But in their world, it was either all real or none of it was real. And it could be real and not real at the same time. It could be a story, but that didn't mean it didn't happen. And it had power. And Thunar was one of those characters that was easy to tell stories about. It was the story that excited the children. It was the stories that excited the warriors. Be like Thunar. You could hear him. You could hear him when he was angered. When you heard that thunder, the rumbling off in the distance, you had a tangible, a direct evidence of Thunar and his mood. Excuse me. And that's why he was so popular. Now you'll be familiar with the idea of Thor and his hammer, Mjolnir, but in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, it may have been a hammer, it may have been an axe, and it was never that short-handled. It was never the short-handled hammer that you see in the Nordic tradition. In the Nordic tradition, they'd wear his hammer around their neck. The Anglo-Saxons would carry his axe or hammer, but a lot of the time it was an axe, from their belt. It was a way of protecting yourself. Thunar protecting you from attack. Thunar's axe would rip through the clouds and it was like when an axe hit stone, sparks would fly. And can just put yourself in their place. How exciting. Imagine seeing a thunderstorm and knowing that Thunar was near. angered, fighting, when your whole being is all about that. And that's why he was so exciting and so popular. And probably one of the reasons that a lot of the sort of neo, in inverted commas, heathen want to be like Thor or Thunar, because they see him as powerful. On to Frige, Friday, sometimes mistaken to be Freya's day or Freya or Fro day. No, it's Frige, the wife of Woden, the most powerful of the female Ylfe. She's the mother of Thunar. She was invoked for many, many reasons: childbirth, conception, love, in some cases, protection. A mother would often invoke Frige to protect her children. She reigned supreme. Probably only coming in second would have been Freya or Freo. But Frige was reigned supreme. She was the Almighty, the goddess Almighty. She is known for, she's the goddess of spinning and weaving, and because that represents her creation. So the most powerful goddess, creator and mother. Your strength is matched only by your wit. You spin and you are binding. She binds things together, and that's why she's the goddess of spinning, often represented holding, as you can see here, a spinning cone that's basically taking wool and turning it into yarn. She's also represented by mistletoe. She hung mistletoe from her belt as a reminder of her lost son, her son that was accidentally killed by a trick that Loki played. She is also the goddess of heartbreak, the loss of children. And that's one of the reasons that she was invoked so much, to protect children, because she understands the loss of children. In a lot of ways, she was tragic. She never, ever got over the loss of her son. And but also celebrated and wonderful and beautiful and very, very quick-witted, known for her ability to see through the lies of Loki and others, even the lies of her own husband. She could also see through magic charms. She could see through people changing their shape and all that sort of stuff. So she was a very powerful and strong woman, and a very, very important deity, mostly to the women folk, but also to men folk as well. Which brings us on to the very last day of the week, Saturday, Saturn's Day. But why? What did they call? Why Saturn's Day? That's a Roman god. Well, there are two references to what the Anglo-Saxons called Saturday. My favorite being Suna Nifren, the eve of the sun, the eve of Sunday, Sunday Eve. Basically, it is a day without a name. It basically is the eve. It's the day before Sunday. The unknown. Unknown is this day, the eve of the sun. You are an enigma. Let us wait for the return. And I always thought that was just such a wonderful name for the day, for this day. You know, it was it was mysterious and interesting. And why would Saturn become that name? Why is it that when the name seemed to be changed when the Roman Church came in, which that in itself is a strange thing to do when they're all about blotting out these old gods and things, but no one knows why. The other name that was bandied about is basically, the rough translation is to wash day. That's the day when you had a wash. And it's still called that in the Nordic countries, bath day, basically. But that's nowhere near as romantic or interesting as Sunu and Afre. So my theory is that it was simply a day of rest and contemplation and waiting for the sun to come back. You know, again, and this is this whole idea of renewal, a new cycle starting. So this is the moment just before that. And that's my theory. But of course, I have no evidence on that. Right. So moving on to the lesser known gods. We've got a few minutes left. So I'm going to try and get through all these as quickly as possible. I'm overrunning on everything. I said, you know, there's a lot to go through. So here we have Gethar. Gethar. And I was going to play some music through this. So here we go. So my wonderful friend David wrote this. I've been working with him to write some songs, and they will be available for people to get. These are inspired by these kind of lesser known gods. And we're trying to write. I'm writing some poetry that goes with them in a bit of a ballad sense. So here we go. So let's start. Story of Gethar. It was said she was born by starlight. The stars got together and the light magically created her. When she opened her eyes for the first time, she looked around and she just saw the chaos of the universe. And that so moved her that she grabbed that chaos and consumed it. She ate it and took it into herself. And by eating that chaos, she became pregnant. She became pregnant to three girls. And she gave birth to these daughters, which would then be called the Modre, the three mothers. And I'll talk a lot more about the Modre soon. But the pain of childbirth was so great for Gethar that she cried out. Great torrents gushed from her eyes. And in those torrents was the wyrd, that ethereal thing that, as I've said, sometimes wrongly translated to fate. The wyrd is something else. The wyrd is all-pervasive. It is unknowable almost. There are bits, turns, and backwaters of your life that always set. And in that sense, the wyrd is fate. But around that is all the other things that happen, those decisions that you make, those places that you go, those things that you see, where free will reigns. But that the wyrd is sometimes called the divine will, divine as in the divination, not divine as in divinity. Divine will, unknowable. The further the wyrd is away from now, the hazier, the harder it is to grasp and see. And so those tears came forth and created the ebbs and flows of the wyrd. And she stood there and she could see those flows and everything in front of her. And she knew that no one, no thing, not even the Itans themselves could escape the flow of the wyrd. This thing that she had put in motion, she could not stop. And so, as not to be tempted to change the course of those things that she herself knew could not and should not be changed, she bound her own eyes. And she climbed into the boat, placing a staff on the ground to help herself in. That staff became lodged in the ground and became what is known as the Great Pillar, Irminsul. The tree of life and death, the tree of the realms. And now, ever bound, she travels on the boat for eternity, traveling the wyrd, being part of it, but not being able to change it. And that's the story of Gethar. And now on to her daughters. The Modre. They are the equivalent of the Norns. If you've heard of them in the Norse tradition. The three daughters, they are the protectors of Irminsul. They represent the three the three parts of a woman's life, the young nubile, the life giver, the young nubile woman, then the life giver, the nurturer, the mother, and then lastly the wise old crone. And so we have the three, the Modre, and they not only protect but nourish, but they also serve a very, very important purpose. The first daughter nourishes the tree. She takes the waters of wisdom to keep and ensure that the tree grows strong, because they're constantly battling the tree's tendency to failure. And that's because they're always battling the Great Serpent. The Great Serpent, whose one purpose is to bring an end to the realms. Nithswicher. His name is Nithswicher Sigre. A very difficult word to say. Is the name of the serpent. The other two, the first is looks at the divine will. She is the diviner. She is the young, the nubile. She is the beginning. She uses her tools and the waters when someone is born to divine those moments in your life that are set in stone, that are written down and will not change. This includes your death. It cannot be rewritten. It cannot be changed. From the moment you live, your death is set. Key moments in your life are set. And then the third is the Scribe, the Crone. She writes on sticks and bark of Irminsul and sets these things in motion. The things she writes down are set and cannot change. And they're constantly fighting Niht Swegele, whose tail is entwined in the roots, always trying to free itself, always gnawing at the tree, trying to destroy it. But they hold it back as best they can. But one day, they won't be able to. And at that time will come the end. The three mothers are honored on Modern Niht, Mother's Night, in Yule. It's thought that it's probably around Christmas Eve, and that's when we honor the three mothers and the work that they do. Represented on the island by the three main rivers, the oldest being the Medina, the oldest sister being the Medina. The other two sisters, the Eastern Yar and the Western Yar. And that's the story of the Mordre. Now let's see how much time we've got. We've got a little bit of time left, so I'll quickly run through our next, the Voskfreyja. I love the cadence of this name, the Voskfreyja. He's more a Ylfe than a god, the Lord of the Whisk, the Lord of the Wished. What is the Wished? It is that magical thing, that will-o'-the-wisp, that ethereal, magical strangeness. It's that moment when you're in the woods and things fall silent and you feel like you are transported to the somewhere. The Voskfreyja, he is the Sandman. He brings the dreams. He brings dreams of adventure or terror. He is said to be born of fire, and he comes to us like wisps of smoke. He is all that is strange and unknowable and magic. He doesn't conform to anything that we may want. He does what he does. He may also be a type of psychopomp as well. There is some parallels and maybe some crossover with the Undirgoð, the god of the under, the underworld god, the god of under. He may help taking souls to hell. And as I said, hell isn't a place of torture at all. It's just the next beginning. It's not like being in Woden's army, but it's certainly not forever torturous. And that's the Voskfreyja. And on to our last. Here we go. Our last, I guess, Ylfe. Wihtlore. Wihtlore. She chooses who dies in battle. That is her job. That's what she does. Her eyes and mouth are sewn shut, and she takes instructions from a serpent around her head. Sometimes she is instructed by Woden to take people in battle to join her army. Now, this is very important, and this goes back to the wyrd, or the wyrd. There was no concept of the wyrd was set in stone. you knew that your time, when your time was going to be up, it was going to be up. You had no choice in that. So ask yourself, would you rather be sitting at home and die, or would you be out in the battlefield and die? Because you couldn't stay home and protect yourself. Keeping someone at home wasn't going to stop them from dying. Because once your time was up, your time was up. When the veiled Kirga came to take you, she would take you. And that's why this idea of fate is kind of, that's one of the reasons that the wyrd is basically translated to fate, because your death is fated. It is going to happen. But you'd rather die in glory than sitting at home cowering, because to them that was you may be chosen for Woden's army. So a little island legend, one that I'll leave you with before we wrap up and go into the Q&A session. It's said that when the island needs its king, Arvold, who was plucked from the battlefield in his last glorious battle against the heretic Gadvala, when the island needs the king again, he will battle his way back from the underworld, and he will have to fight the Valkyrga, and he will fight her to regain his mortal body. When he bests her, she will give him his mortal body back so he can come back and rebuild his house to protect his people once again, until it is time for him to rejoin Woden. And on that note, I'd like to say thank you very much for everyone who came along and took the time out tonight. And off to like every time we have a Q&A session. So I'm going to stop sharing. And well, if I can work out how to stop sharing. How do we stop sharing? Stop sharing. There we go. And I'll open up the floor to you guys. Any questions? Now, the one thing that I must always say, keep in mind and keep remembering, nothing is made up. It's only remembered differently. So, open to you guys. Anyone have any questions? Richard.
Yes, I have several, but we'll take it in turns. And the first one's a very simple one. You talked right at the beginning about Eton, and I wondered whether that word is related to our word heathen.
It could well be. It could be. I mean, it does have a very similar sound to it. It could well be that I do know that it is the root of entity, you know, as a thing. But yeah, that's very worthwhile looking into. Thank you very much. I hadn't thought of that. It could be where heathen comes from. I'll look into that. Thank you. Any other questions? If not, Richard, go ahead. Ask all your questions.
Right. I like patterns, and all of these gods, spirits, elves don't really form a pattern. So, bearing in mind what you say about things being remembered differently, are these people, if I can call them that, being remembered from different times in Jutish mythology?
It's a really good question. First of all, I'll address your patterns comment. You're absolutely right. I mean, you have to remember that these stories, you know, if you were to take, let's use a biblical analogy. So, John, Tiffany, I'll be with you in 1 second. Let me just finish here. So if we look at use a biblical analogy, if you take the stories out and you try and find, and if you sort of hark back and look at the contradictions between even story, the same story, you will sometimes have patterns and sometimes you won't. And I think and this leads on to what you were saying, is, are they remembered at different times? I think absolutely what we're talking about here is stories that have come about at different times, told by different people, remembered by different people, and passed on in different ways. And you end up with this rich tapestry. And each story in itself, I think the beauty in a lot of these stories is in the plot holes. That's always been something that has attracted me to these stories, and the chaos in a lot of cases. But I think there are a lot of patterns as well. There are distinct personalities, and that's what you get in reality. And these jobs and these gods had personalities like you and I did. Have I sort of answered your question?
Kind of. I think if you were to answer it any more, we'd still be here tomorrow or next week.
Okay.
That'll do for now.
Okay, John. John.
Yeah, hello, Paul. Beautiful pronunciation of the names and such, which leads me into the question of how did you learn to pronounce the names correctly?
Well, I went to university and became a historian, and became a doctor in history.
Well, that's one way of doing it.
No, actually, to be honest, we aren't 100% sure of the pronunciation. All we can know for sure is that that it's probably a cross between German and Icelandic. Icelandic being the closest to the Nordic the old Nordic pronunciations, and a lot of the words, the compound words, and the v sound instead of a w sound and things like that, we know from sort of the German, but we also know by looking at what was called the Great Vowel Shift. So at some point in English, there was a thing called the Great Vowel Shift, and the Great Vowel Shift was basically where we change the pronunciation of our vowels, where O that we say oh now would have been an oo sound, and we went from a tonal language to a non-tonal language. So the tone and of the way things were said also told us a lot about the word. And that's why you'll see in early English writing, say Chaucer and things like that, there will be the same word spelt differently. And the reason is because he would have been pronouncing it differently, because it was a tonal, by giving that tone. And that's why you'll see that. So the way I learned how to pronounce it was a little bit of what I did at university, a lot of listening to Icelandic, a lot of listening to German, and getting the vowels, getting the words, the letters. So the words and the v's, right? The th and the d, right? The us and the ors, and the rolling of the tongue, getting that sort of stuff, and just listening. A wonderful resource is, there's a website, I can't remember what it's called now. It's something like Pronounce Wiki, something like that. It's a very good resource. If you want to learn how to pronounce these words, put in there and then listen to the Icelandic pronunciation, listen to the German pronunciation, and just start getting your tongue around that. And that's the thing, you got to get your tongue around it, because it does take, and even I stumble, you heard me stumbling on certain words, because you'll have letters that my tongue is not used to pronouncing next to each other, and I stumble. But the more you do it, the better you can. And I'm always here to help people if anyone ever needs any help. Does that answer your question?
I might call upon you about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to help.
Yeah.
Nick.
Thank you so much.
No problem, John. Nick, you had a question.
Hi, just figuring out how to unmute. Sorry. Hiya. Right. Like most children in Britain in the 1980s, I was taught that Odin's Day was Wednesday and Thor's Day was Thursday, but I was taught Freya's Day was Friday. So this was a revelation to me that it isn't. Yeah. No. It was a bit kind of, whoa, what? And being a primary school teacher, I have actually taught the Vikings and I have actually taught Freya's Day as Friday. So I apologise to all the children I've ever taught because I was wrong. So it wasn't really a question. It was just a thank you for educating me, because from now on, I won't do that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, it's common mistake.
Yeah.
And Freya and Frige sometimes mixed up, but they are two separate goddesses. Frige being and Freya or Freo. There is even some indication that there was conflict between those two. Frige seeing her coming up on her, seeing Freo coming up on her shirt, her coattails, as it were.
Yeah.
So there is some indication, but whether it's like anything, it becomes real when you make it real.
Oh, absolutely.
That makes sense.
I totally get that. It's just a total revelation. I'm glad I was on mute, because I went, what?
Well, there we go.
That doesn't fit with what I've learned and what I've been teaching. That's crazy. So thank you very much for that.
my pleasure.
No worries.
Richard, do you have any other questions?
I do. I have a question and a comment. But if there are other people, so the question I have is, when did we start having weeks, and did different, is the week that the Jutes are using related to the week that the Jews are using, or did they come about separately?
Right, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that I've pondered myself. So the Jutes and the Anglo-Saxons, their calendar was a lunar calendar, very much a lunar cycle, lunar calendar. And everything was kind of based around that. In fact, you saw that in the early Christian church. There was almost a schism right in the beginning when the Roman church came over, and they saw that the Celtic and Germanic churches were kind of basing stuff on things that sort of went back to this lunar cycle. The days of the week seems to be like, it seems almost like almost a universal thing in Western Europe, a 7-day week, a 7-day cycle. And that could purely be a mathematical thing, but it's something that I've pondered myself. Unfortunately, there's no records. We don't know for sure. All we can go on is what we have. And, we have the Venerable Bede, we have Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, we have Snorri's work, we have that sort of thing. But they're all through the lens of Christianity, and they're all through a historical perspective. So I know this isn't really answering your question. The short answer is I don't know, and I don't think anyone does. The long answer is it looks like probably they had a 7-day week, but but the rest of the calendar was very much a lunar thing, a lunar cycle. And it could be that they may not have even had the concept of a week until later on. But we don't know is the answer.
Right. Yes, I suppose that would that would possibly tie up with the days of the week being associated with quite well-formed characters.
Mm. But there was also a memory, a Roman memory as well. So pre-Anglo-Saxon, a Romanic memory as well. So that people kind of think that the Romans came and conquered, and then they left, and everything descended into darkness. But it's kind of not what really happened. Yes, the Romans left, and they kind of said, "You guys fend for yourself." They asked the Germanic tribes, Germanic warriors come, but there was a second Roman invasion with the Roman Church. But there was always this memory of the original Roman occupation. So it may well have been that, this weak thing had already been supplanted. Because you have to remember that the Germanic tribes had already had experience with the Roman Empire, even before the fall of Rome. Because
Rome was everywhere.
Yeah, Rome was everywhere, and these Germanic tribes were all in the north of Europe, and they were trading with Rome. And it was the Germanic tribes that eventually sacked Rome. And all kind of related.
Okay, so it would be interesting to know if the Celts also had a week. If the British, that the Romans displaced and intermingled with. But
again, it's very difficult, and this goes back to the whole recreationist thing. We anyone that says a definitive, this is the way it was, is effectively telling porcupines, because there is no definitive answer to a lot of these, because the oral tradition didn't preserve that.
This was really outside of the oral tradition, and this is a how it was question, and I know there's an awful lot of how it was. I was thinking, I cannot relate to these things in the way that someone 1,500 years ago might have done, because I've had science in my life for as long as I can remember. I know what goes on in the sky to a first approximation, and I cannot put myself in the frame of mind where I don't know that, where I don't believe in explanations of a straightforward that noise as things getting hot kind.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I mean, I think that there's a difference between telling a story and invocation of these stories and the propagation of these stories and scientific fact. I think some people can quite easily and quite happily have those things run in parallel. I know scientists who can easily believe in the scientific method. They can believe in physics and from a macro level right down to a quantum level, the Big Bang, everything. But they can also quite easily believe in a higher entity or a god. And then on the flip side, I know a lot of people who cannot believe in anything mythological or nothing that they don't believe in anything that isn't proven, because that's the you can't prove a negative, so therefore I'm not going to, science can't prove it, therefore I don't know, is generally the answer. And again, it's fine. I think from my perspective, and that's if you want my perspective is I think science is the most important thing in this world. It's what makes plane flies. It's what's protecting us from this hideous disease. It is what tells us that there's a black hole in the center of the galaxy. It's what tells us that there are subatomic particles and all those amazing things. It's what makes my phone work. It's what allows me to talk to you right now. It is the foundation of our society. Absolutely. But I don't think it takes away from, as my old dad used to say, either it's all real or none of it's real. So I'm happy to live in a world that has a bit of magic to talk about. And I see them as two distinct things.
That isn't quite what I was. I mean, I don't dispute any of that. You're right. But what I was really saying at the beginning, again, you said that in telling these stories, you invoke the forces. You didn't say invoke the forces, but you did say invoke.
Mm-hmm.
And
from an Anglo-Saxon or a Jutes perspective, that's what you are doing.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
And from my late 20th century scientific perspective, that's not what I'm doing. And I find it impossible to put myself in a frame of mind where it's anything except really interesting stuff.
And that's okay. I don't see any issue with that at all. I think the no problem, Nick. Thank you for. Sorry, Nick's just sent me a message.
Yep.
Thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed yourself. So I think that's fine. I think bye. Right. Talk to you soon. Lovely. I think that's okay. I think it doesn't take away from the enjoyment. Believing, having science as your foundation and not being able to put yourself in that mindset, because it is a different mindset and it is a different way. It's like, as I said right in the very beginning, the way we think about things is not the way they thought about things. It's like trying to put yourself in, if you're a 20th century, 21st century Christian, trying to put your mind in the same mindset of a medieval Christian. They would not recognize each other. They do not recognize each other. If you took someone from medieval Europe and transplanted them today, if you transplanted them into the Bible Belt of the USA, for example, they would not recognize what they call Christianity at all. It'd be completely foreign to them. That would not be Christianity to them. If you transplant, but I don't think it takes, so it's difficult, I think, to put your head in the mind of someone that you may not necessarily understand, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And that also was by way of a comment rather than a question. And I've heard all the Norse names. I'm halfway familiar with it, but actually I found it a bit of a distraction, if you don't mind my saying so. Having the mythology of the Jutes contrasted with the mythology that I very vaguely know of any other northern domain. It would have been easier for me just to stay entirely within the Jutish world.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair comment. I think the reason I did that was because the names are so prolific, they are so well known. And I really wanted to stress that there are differences, but there are also, the names are cognate, they are, you can draw parallels.
Okay, fair enough. And anyway, I'm okay. So that's really all I've got.
Okay. Does anyone else have any questions about anything? No more?
They're just being shy,
No,
Paul.
Maybe they are. Well, if that's it and everyone's everyone's had their fill. Thank you so much for coming. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. I hope you enjoyed the stories, because that's what it really was about. And I hope you learnt one or two things. And I hope you didn't find it too boring. Thank you so much. Next month, I'm not sure what I'm going to be talking about, but please join me again. Hopefully next month, actually, I'm going to be doing them live from Sandown Library here on the island, but I'll also be streaming them live as well. So hopefully we'll have a live audience as well as a remote live audience. So thank you very much, and have a lovely evening, everyone. This will be up on YouTube in the next day or so. And if anyone wants any of the slides or anything like that, please let me know and I can send them across to you. And the music and the artwork is available to those that want it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Paul.